There's a picture that's been out on the internet for a number of years. It's circulated pretty widely, and you may have seen it. It's a picture of a dead possum on a highway, and it has been mashed flat. Now, there's nothing particularly unique about that. Possums get run off the road all the time. I don't know why, but they're particularly bad. But then the road come along and paint right over the smashed do if it doesn't fall right my particular set of. I've got to believe that businesses fail fairly regularly because too many employees have that mindset. It's not my job. I'm not doing it. I don't know who does it, but it's not my job, and I'm certainly not going to do it. Businesses do not succeed very well when employees have that attitude. We can't afford to have that attitude in the Lord's church either. We certainly can't afford to let the church fail. Yet there are far too many Christians who fail to recognize and are unwilling to fulfill the necessary responsibilities in the local church. Our series of lessons this week is along that line. We're talking about each individual Christian and the responsibilities that he or she has in the local church. I've heard from more than one source that these lessons are different than we usually have in a gospel meeting, and I would agree with that. But I certainly hope that the lessons can be helpful and that all of us will learn and be motivated to become more like God wants us to be, especially in relationship to our participation in the local church and the fulfilling of our responsibilities that we have there. So thanks for coming. Thanks for your interest in Bible topics and Bible things. We're glad that you're here tonight and appreciate very much your coming and offering your encouragement and your participation in the things that we're doing here in this gospel meeting. As always, any questions that you might have, please let them be known. Say something to me or to one of the others here who might be able to help in answering any Bible questions that you have. If there's something that you want to know more about, we'd be anxious to study with you. Just say a word. Tonight, our lesson has to do with conflict resolution in the local church. And someone might say, well, why are we talking about that? Is that a wasted lesson? Why would we need to talk about conflict resolution in the church? Is there conflict in the church? Well, yes. Unfortunately, every congregation from time to time has to deal with conflicts. The reason why there's conflicts in churches is because we're dealing with people. And we're dealing with personalities. And whenever we have people together and have personalities together, it provides the potential for disagreements and disputes, and therefore conflicts may arise, and often do. It's not a new thing. In fact, it's interesting that when we go back in the pages of the New Testament, just nearly as soon as the church began, there were conflicts that had to be addressed. In the very early chapters of the book of Acts, we read about that first church in Jerusalem. And they hadn't existed for very long at all until there were some problems that had to be worked out. And they of course, were successful in doing that, but it simply proves that conflicts will arise in any congregation. Conflicts arise between Christians. In Acts chapter 15, we read about the Apostle Paul and his close working companion. They had been very close working together, Paul and Barnabas. But they had a disagreement that was so strong that they decided to go in different directions and work in different geographical areas. Now, I don't think it was a problem that caused them to lose confidence in one another or to fail to share in their common faith with one another, but they chose to work in different directions because of a disagreement that they had between the two of them. All of those kind of things, and probably lots more instances that we could cite, emphasize that there definitely will be conflicts in local churches. I think as Christians we should not be surprised or unduly discouraged when that reality hits the local congregation that we're a member of. Now, it can't be ignored. We would rather, of course, that such things never come up, but they do. And when they do, we should talk about how the Bible would have us to address conflicts in the local congregation. Now, I want to emphasize that in talking about this, we're not talking in vague generalities. We're talking about your job in helping resolve conflicts. My job in helping resolve the conflicts that arise where I'm a member. We're not just saying there will be conflicts, they have to be addressed. What we're saying is there will be conflicts, you need to address them. There will be conflicts that you have to help resolve, and we need to know what the Bible would tell us about doing that. So what would we suggest about conflict resolution in the local church? The very first thing is that we need to always remember that truth cannot be compromised. This is really a necessary baseline for us to start with. We need to have this very firmly committed, and every Christian in a local congregation has to be devoted to this principle. Truth cannot be compromised. There's just been way too much compromise in most religious groups, and even in some congregations of the Lord's people. We have found that they have sort of compromised to get along and keep people happy. Once you begin to compromise the truth, though, the question is, where do we stop? Once we open that door and say, well, we're going to give in on this matter of truth just to keep such and such a person happy. For instance, here's Kieran. You know, he's got the penultimate Irish name. He has Irish heritage. He lived for a number of years and worked in Ireland. He's really devoted to his Irish heritage, you know. And so what Kieran would like to do is he'd like to incorporate Irish dance into the worship here of the local congregation, you know. It's very important to him. He really thinks that would really top things off, you know, just make it right. Well, some of us are pretty uneasy about that Irish dance thing in general, much less about incorporating it into worship. But you know, we want to keep Kieran happy. Okay, we'll give in and we'll let Kieran do his Irish dance thing in the worship. Well, if you do that, if you're going to let Kieran have what he wants, if you're going to compromise truth to accommodate Kieran, and I'm going to tell you, you're going to have to accommodate me too, right? Because I'll tell you what I want to do. Some of you are aware of the fact that I'm pretty keen on pancakes with maple syrup, Phil. And what I would like to do is to get those pancakes and maple syrup here. Maybe in the Lord's Supper, you know. We could have pancakes and maple syrup. You let Kieran have his dance routine in the worship, and if he can have that, then you can't say no to me about my pancakes. You see where we're headed now? Of course, all of that is tongue-in-cheek, obviously, but you get the point. Once you start and you begin to compromise the truth, there's no stopping place. We have to be committed to God's truth, and it cannot be compromised. Look to a New Testament example that's much more to the point. Mine were sort of tongue-in-cheek, but here's a real situation where there was a problem, and there was some contention and conflict. Notice how Paul addressed this. In Galatians chapter 2, beginning verse 3, Paul is telling about when he went to Jerusalem because there was a problem, a doctrinal problem about the matter of circumcision. It was a big deal, a big problem in the first century church. In the book of Acts, we read about it in chapter 15, but here in Galatians 2, Paul's retelling or giving some information about what went on at Jerusalem. And in Galatians chapter 2, beginning verse 3, he says, "But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren, unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty, that we have the liberty that we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage." And so the problem was there were these ones who were insisting that Gentile converts to Christianity be circumcised. Paul knew that that was not the truth of God. Paul knew the truth on that subject. And so here were these people. They were insisting on it, but it was not true to God's revelation. What was Paul's attitude toward that? He said, "To whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you." I think we all need to really sort of memorize that expression. To whom we gave place, no, not for an hour. Paul wouldn't compromise the truth of God. Not at all. Now, someone could say, "Come on, Paul, you got to give in a little bit here. You got to ease back. You have to compromise a little. You got to to maintain peace and to keep these people somewhat happy, you're going to have to yield a little bit on that point. And of course, Paul's answer was no, not for an hour. And that's got to be our attitude too. So when it comes to conflict in the local church, if it's a matter of doctrine, truth, and righteousness, no compromise. We just simply can't compromise, and we all have to accept that as being the case. All right, now with that understood, what are some other considerations that come into play? Well, I believe that we all need to be firmly committed to maintaining peace. Now, we already said, and everything we'll say hereafter is based upon what we already said. You can't compromise truth. But in any way that does not compromise truth, we need to be committed to maintaining peace. Peace needs to be a priority. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 3, it says, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. In other words, you got to put forth effort to see to it that there is peace among brethren. The implication of that is that if you don't work at it, it won't happen. Peace in a local congregation just doesn't happen by chance. It requires Christians in a local body to be committed to it and do everything that they can to keep it going. Some other translations saying making every effort to keep peace. Another says being diligent to preserve unity. One version says eager to maintain unity. And all of that addresses the idea that it has to be important to us and we have to work at it. There's a great lesson in the Old Testament that comes from the patriarch Abraham. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this story. In Genesis chapter 13, Abraham and his nephew Lot had come into the land of Canaan, and they had really prospered there. And their herds and their flocks had increased. And notice in Genesis chapter 13, verse 8, beginning, Abram said unto Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we be brethren. There's the key expression in that story. Abraham said, we be brethren. Let there be no strife between us. He says, is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. Abraham, who was the elder in the matter, he was older. He was the uncle. Lot was his nephew. But he was willing to do whatever he could. And he was even willing to take the less. He was willing to suffer personal loss. You go that way, I'll go the other. But I give you the choice. We be brethren. We need to have that attitude. And I'm sad to say that too often in churches, that just doesn't exist. People just don't think that way. And I wonder, where is the loyalty to one another? Where is the love that's supposed to exist between us as Christians? Some are just absolutely ready to fight at the slightest provocation. The things that are not even that important or significant. Sometimes when you hear about a situation in a congregation off somewhere and they've had big trouble, maybe you've heard about a church split. Well, that's bad to hear that expression, the church split. And then they begin to tell you what the trouble was about. And sometimes you're dumbfounded and you think, you split the church over that? You know, it seems so unimportant. Now, understand, we said earlier, we can't compromise truth. But so often these disagreements that lead to real contention and trouble in the church are not that important. They're not matters of doctrine. And if Christians had the attitude, we be brethren, that Abraham expressed here in this passage, we'd be so much better off. And so, two things. First priority is truth. We can't compromise truth. But an important priority also is peace and maintaining peace, and we have to be determined to do our best to make that happen. Now, along that lines, what will help make it happen? Well, one thing we need to do in a local congregation is we need to take time to communicate with one another. You know, communication solves lots of problems. And they don't even become problems if we just take time to talk to each other. Several years ago, there was a brother. I thought everything was fine. I had no inclination that there was anything going on at all. But suddenly this fellow announced he was leaving. He was mad and he was leaving. His name was Glenn. I said, Glenn, what's the problem? He said, I've been mad at you for 2 years. I said, you've been mad at me? I was dumbfounded because I thought we had good, friendly, brotherly relations, you know. And I said, "You've been mad at me?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Ever since you preached that lesson about raising children." I said, "Well, what do you have in mind?" He said, "You preached that if children ever grow up and leave the faith, it is always the parents' fault." I said, "Glenn, now I confess that sometimes I don't express myself very well, but I never taught that. And the reason I know I never taught that is because I don't even believe that. I couldn't have possibly taught it because I've never believed that. You know." I said, "Why didn't you ask me? You've been mad at me for 2 years. If you'd have just asked me, we could have cleared that up in 30 seconds. You've been carrying this in your heart for 2 years, and it didn't have to last for 30 seconds. Why didn't you just talk to me?" My guess is that many of you who are Christians here tonight, if we were to talk about past occurrences, you could relate similar instances where if someone would have just said something, it could have been worked out so fast. We just need to communicate with one another. Many imagined problems are simply misunderstandings that can be quickly cleared up, but not if I am the kind of a person who immediately assumes combat mode. Someone says something, or I think they said something, or I imagine that they believe something, and I'm ready to fight over it before I ever even talk about it. We need to communicate. You know how this goes. There's actually two sides to this coin. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 23, Jesus said, "Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift." Now, break that down for a minute. Who's the one in the wrong here? I'm the one in the wrong, right? I'm trying to worship God, but I realize that my brother has aught against me. I've done something to wrong him. What am I supposed to do? I'm the one at fault. I'm the one who's caused this problem. What am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to go to my brother, right? Now, the other side of that story is in Matthew 18, verse 15. In Matthew 18:15, Jesus said, "Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother." Now here's the roles are reversed. Now this time, it's Peter back there who has wronged me. So what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to go to Peter, right? But if you put that together, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is the guy who did the wrong and the guy who's been wronged are going to meet halfway somewhere. And if both of them are working at resolution, it's solved, right? The problem disappears because they have worked it out. We meet in the middle. And so what we're saying is it's very important to communicate. If there's a problem, get busy addressing it. Don't let it linger. Don't stew upon it. Don't let it fester. Get to the root of it. Communicate with one another to resolve that. Remembering that we should be firmly committed to maintaining peace. And so we got to communicate with one another when there's a problem. I would also say that you've got to, as you approach these issues, it's sad to say issues come up in local churches. We know that. We haven't got our heads stuck in the sand. We are aware that problems come up. When they do, we need to consider our brethren as honest souls who are trying to do what's right. Now, we should approach it from that direction. I disagree with my brother. Well, there's some trouble here, but I'm going to approach him as though he's a good, honest person, and he really has good intention. He's trying to do what's right. An expression that we often use is the expression, give the benefit of the doubt. And we should approach it that way. We disagree, but he's a good man, and I know he really wants to do what's right. He's wanting to do God's will, and so I'm going to approach him in that way. And I believe if it's possible, we can work this out. Now, the opposite of that attitude is, that fella, he's a scoundrel. I'm telling you, he's a scoundrel. I've always had my doubts about him. I'm not surprised that he would pull a trick like this. You see the difference in attitude there? In other words, I give him no benefit of the doubt at all. I assume the worst about him and then act upon that. Well, there's very low probability of success in resolving that conflict if I approach my brother in that way. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, beginning verse 4, We read about the characteristics of love. This is the King James Version that I have on the chart, and it uses the word charity, but we would use the word love. It's the same thing. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. There's so much about love that demands that we give our brother the benefit of the doubt. So many of the characteristics that are found right here in this text, but especially these last ones. The person who has love bears all things. In other words, he's willing to work at this. And he also believes all things. I think that's the idea, that you go into it assuming the best motives of your brother. You don't believe the worst about him, you believe the best about him. You hope for a good outcome. You don't enter into it with a sort of a negative, predetermined, this will never be fixed attitude. You're willing to endure all things. You're willing to persevere and see to it that it gets done. There's so much about love that is contrary to the attitude of, I suspected that of him. I always imagined that he would do something like that. That's just a wrong attitude. Well, if we're going to solve problems in the local church, we need to start out with the consideration that our brothers are honest people and they're trying to do what's right. And we're going to approach them in that way. Also, we need to realize that no one has all the best answers. Notice, no one has all the best answers, not even me. I don't always have all the best answers. Now, remember what we said earlier, and I would remind you of the very first point. We're not talking about matters of truth and righteousness. We're not talking about doctrinal faithfulness. We're talking about where there are questions of judgment, where opinion is allowed, and we are to pursue expedients to get God's work done. Now, when it's in the realm of judgment, I need to be willing to accept that my ideas are not necessarily the ones that have to be followed. Of course, I think my ideas are good. If I didn't think my ideas were good, I'd take on some other different ideas, Everybody thinks their ideas are good. That's understood. But in humility, I have to acknowledge that I'm not the only one who has ideas. And someone else's might be better than mine. In matters of judgment, we need to be willing to submit to one another. In 1 Peter chapter 5, beginning verse 5, likewise ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble. Humble yourselves therefore unto the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time. Be submissive to one another. And when we can, when it's not a matter that would compromise the truth, then I need to say, if you strongly feel that way, then I can go with that. It doesn't have to be my way. My opinion doesn't have to be followed in that judgment call. We'll follow your idea. We need to be submissive in that way and recognize that it doesn't have to be my way in those kinds of things. I would argue that when there is conflict, we can also gain help by seeking the input of other faithful Christians. I'm sure you would agree with me when I say sometimes when there is an intense problem, and if you're closely connected to that problem, sometimes you're so close to the problem that you cannot see clearly. We have the old expression, so close that you can't see the forest for the trees. And sometimes when it comes to problems, we get in problems that exist between brethren, problems in a local congregation. Sometimes if you're one of the principal ones involved in that problem, you may be so close to it that you cannot see objectively. In those kinds of situations, it's very helpful to get counsel from someone who is more objective and someone who is maybe a little bit more detached from the immediate problem. Typically, that can happen even right within the members of the local congregation. I've got a contention with Al. And we've been at it for a while now, and it doesn't seem like it's getting any better. And maybe I need to get counsel from Brad. Maybe Brad can help with that. I mean, it just seems so clear to me that Al is just desperately wrong. And I can't get past that. Well, maybe Brad can help me see it a different way, right? And so that's what I'm suggesting. Even right within the local congregation, there are also, most all of us know faithful Christians in other places that might be called upon for help and counsel. Now, I want you to be sure here that I'm not talking about gossiping about a church problem. There's a difference between seeking counsel and gossiping. Gossiping is not productive. There's no benefit to it. In fact, gossip tears down rather than builds up. Gossip compounds a problem rather than solving a problem. I'm not talking about that here. I'm talking about getting help, beneficial help and counsel from someone who can provide it. In Proverbs chapter 11, verse 14, it says, "Where no counsel is, the people fall. Where no counsel is, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety." The wise statement there in the Proverbs suggests that we need to get some opinions, need to get somebody else to help us. A similar statement in chapter 12 of Proverbs, verse 15, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise." If I will listen to what someone else has to say, of course I think I'm right. If I didn't think I was right, I would give up my position. But I may be foolish in that. I need to get somebody else to give an opinion, and that would be a wise thing to do. So when conflict or trouble arises, seek input from other faithful Christians. An important aspect of this, we're talking about conflict resolution, trouble in the church. What are you going to do about that? If you're a member of this local church and you're aware of problems in the church, then it is your responsibility to help make it right, correct the problem. And so we're making some suggestions as to how you can do that. Certainly you need to resist the temptation to become bitter and resentful. Trouble is not pleasant. I have in the past many times said there is no trouble like church trouble. In almost all relationships there can be problems. But I'm telling you, when there's problems in the church, it is of a unique and horrible kind that just can really cut you to the heart. Trouble in the church is not pleasant. But even though it is such a difficult time, there is no justification for ever growing bitter or resentful or establishing a grudge. I've got a grudge against somebody, and I'm going to carry that grudge, and I'm going to act accordingly. Someone said, get this, see, this is pretty good, I think. Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. And that is really true. Wouldn't you agree that when we become bitter, resentful, when we harbor a grudge or we're angry, we're just hurting ourselves in that matter. In James chapter 5, verse 9, it says, "Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth at the door." Notice there that holding a grudge leads to condemnation. You will be judged for doing that, according to James 5, verse 9. Instead of that, we should be, as is taught here in Ephesians 4, beginning verse 31, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice, and be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." And so, again, I would say, resist that temptation. And the reason I say resist the temptation is because it is a temptation. It's very easy to allow ourselves to slip into the mode of being bitter and resentful and angry, and harboring a grudge. Resist that temptation. Don't let it go there. All right. Now, remember the theme of our whole series of lessons is an individual's responsibility in the local church. And I want to stress to you again that this is not the idea of, well, there's trouble in the church and I'm expecting Kieran to get it straightened out. I'm just waiting for Kieran. He's the preacher after all. Let him do something about this. Something needs to be done. Kieran needs to get busy here. No, that's not the way it works. I hope you appreciate that what we talked about tonight involves every one of us. If we're a member of a local body and there's trouble, then it's our job to try our best to make it right. Now, how does that help the local church? Our theme is individual responsibilities in the local church. How is that helpful to the local church? Why does that matter? Well, I want to give you an example from the Scripture of two different churches. One was not dealing with their problems at all. and the other was right in their relationships between themselves. And I want you to notice the contrast. The first church I have in mind is Corinth. Corinth was a church with trouble. There was all kinds of problems in the church at Corinth. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11, Paul said, "It hath been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are of the house of Chloe, that there are contentions among you." In other words, Paul wasn't even there, but he was hearing about the trouble that existed in the church at Corinth. And really, this book we call 1 Corinthians deals with a number of different problems that existed there in that church. In chapter 3, verse 3, Paul said, "Ye are yet carnal, for whereas there is among you envying and strife and divisions, are ye not carnal and walk as men?" Lots of problems in Corinth. For instance, in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, Paul talked about the fact that there was an immoral man in their number, and they hadn't done anything to discipline him, and led a horrible, disgraceful, even in the community, it was a disgraceful situation. They were allowing it to go on. They hadn't done anything about it. In chapter 6, they were so at one another that they were even suing one another before the civil authorities. Just all kinds of problems. Chapter 11, they couldn't even take the Lord's Supper with one another in a peaceful, brotherly manner. They were even abusing the Lord's Supper. In chapters 12, 13, and 14, they were arguing about spiritual gifts. One fellow says, "I speak in tongues, and I'm better than you because all you can do is prophesy." And they were even at each other about who was better than the other in relationship to the miraculous spiritual gifts they enjoyed back there in that first century time period. There was just all kinds of trouble at Corinth. Now, when you're reading 1 Corinthians, you get the idea that nothing good was happening as a result. Because there was so much contention and strife at Corinth, you don't hear Paul talking about any good things that were coming out of that church. There was so much conflict, and they were having so much trouble with one another that they were consuming all their energies on that. Nothing good was happening because they weren't dealing with the problems and getting them fixed. Right? So Corinth is a negative example. You let problems continue in a local church, you don't fix them, then nothing good can be expected. Bad will go to worse if we're not doing our job in conflict resolution, as we've talked about tonight. I want you to contrast Corinth with the church at Thessalonica. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 9, Paul says, "As touching brotherly love, ye need not that I write unto you, for ye yourselves know," or excuse me, "ye yourselves are taught of God to love one another. And indeed ye do it toward all the brethren which are in all Macedonia. But we beseech you, brethren, that ye increase more and more." Now, if you agree with me, I take that as high commendation that Paul's given for the church at Thessalonica. He said, "I really don't even need to write to you all about brotherly love because you have a very well-known track record. And you are working together in a peaceful, brotherly manner. You show your love for one another. I don't even really need to talk to you about that, but I would encourage you, keep growing in that. Do more of it. It's good. Keep it up. Get better." All right, so here's a church at Thessalonica that seemed to be at peace, and they were working well together. As a result of that, notice what he said in chapter 1, beginning verse 7. "So that ye were examples to all that believe in Macedonia and Achaia. For from you sounded out the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith to Godward is spread abroad, so that we need not to speak anything." Now, Paul's using an exaggeration here when he says, "I don't even need to say anything now because you all been doing so much good in spreading the gospel." But he's using that figure of speech there to emphasize the fact he's really commending them here. "You all have done such a good job of getting the message out." He said, "It's like I don't hardly even need to say anything because you have been so powerful in getting the word of the Lord out all around your geographical region." Well, why do you think the church at Thessalonica was able to do such a powerful job of spreading the gospel to the lost in those regions? Well, one factor, which I think is very important, is the one that he mentioned when he said, "You all have good brotherly love. You show it to one another. You work together in harmony and peace. And your love is obvious. You're well known for the loving, peaceful relationship that exists in that local congregation." So what we have there is a contrast between Corinth and Thessalonica. Corinth was a church in conflict, and they weren't fixing it. And therefore nothing good was happening at Corinth. Thessalonica, on the other hand, a church at peace, where the brothers loved one another and showed it. And they're doing a great job of getting a message spread. And so, what will the church here be like? Which of those two churches would best exemplify the church at Milton, Vermont, or the church in Columbia, Tennessee, where I'm a member? Well, we obviously want to be like Thessalonica, not like Corinth. And if that's going to be the case, then we have to, each one of us, take it upon ourselves as a personal responsibility to make sure that when problems come up, and they will come up, unfortunately, when problems come up, we do everything that's in our power to help make it right. Thanks for your good attention to what we've had to say, and hope it's been helpful. I really believe that if we put these kind of biblical principles into practice, we'll be better for it, the church will be better for it, and God will bless us as we seek to do His will. Thanks for your good attention to what we've had to say. We're going to sing a song of invitation. We always do that when we're together, because even when we have a lesson like this one tonight that doesn't talk about what you must do to be saved, or to establish and maintain, how to establish and maintain a right relationship with God. Even though we've not talked about that tonight, we wouldn't want to end without giving an opportunity for all who are here. Think about your relationship with God. If you've never become a Christian, you need to become one. The gospel plan of salvation is hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. If you need more information, if you'd like to know more about the answer to the very simple question, what must I do to be saved? If you'll ask, we'll be glad to sit down with you and study. If you're a Christian already, but you've fallen away, we bid you come back in repentance, confession, and prayer. If we can help, let us know while we stand and sing.